Hello, my name is Vince Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I'll also touch on some of his prose writings as well, letters, sermons, etc. I've long been fascinated with Hopkins. I remember buying my parish priest as a teenager a volume of his poetry, and I remember reading the Record of Deutschland at the time, and I couldn't make head nor tail of it. However, something about that poem really resonated with me in some way, and when I came back to that poem and Hopkins' poems generally many years later, I just found them so inspiring, so moving, so original, and also so musical. As a musician myself, reading these poems out loud are really a joy to the ears, not just to the mind and the heart. Hopkins really understood sound. And in the last couple of weeks or so, I've just reread many of the poems in this volume, the major works published by Oxford University Press and edited by Catherine Phillips. A really good volume of everything you really need to read, I suppose, for the layperson. Now, Hopkins was born in 1844 to kind of well-off Victorian family. He grew up in Hampstead and went to Highgate School, where his literary talents were encouraged. He then went to Oxford, Balliol College, where he continued to write poetry, but also became a Roman Catholic. He was always a devout Anglican, high Anglican, and inspired by the likes of Newman, he decided that he needed to embrace Catholicism completely. And that cost him somewhat socially and in terms of his family life. But Hopkins was never one to compromise, it seems, and he went ahead with being a Catholic in an age where there's still a lot of suspicion around Roman Catholicism. And eventually he became a Jesuit and eventually ordained as a priest. He burned his youthful poetry in 1868, seeing some kind of tension between his poetic gifts and his vocation as a priest. But then he resumed poetry in a somewhat awe-inspiring way with his longest poem, the Record of Deutschland, in 1875. And that started a kind of chain of masterpieces throughout the rest of his life. As a Jesuit, Hopkins was moved around the country, up into poverty-stricken cities in the north of England, into Glasgow as well. Eventually he had a teaching post in Dublin, where he felt incredibly isolated and depressed, and he wrote his terrible sonnets there, his so-called terrible sonnets. He died at the young age of 44. Now, Hopkins was completely unknown in his lifetime as a poet. The only people who really knew his poetry was some of his fellow Jesuits. Canon Richard Watson Dixon, who was an older figure connected with the pre-Raphaelite movement, who taught Hopkins earlier on in his life, and most importantly Robert Bridges, who was a renowned poet in his own right, but who corresponded with Hopkins regularly, critiquing each other's poetry. And it was Bridges who published Hopkins' poetry in 1918, long after Hopkins' death in 1889. And it wasn't until the 1930s really that Hopkins became well known and indeed became regarded as one of the most important and certainly the most original of the Victorian poets. He became a huge influence on subsequent figures throughout the rest of the 20th century. Now, Hopkins' poetry is definitely in kind of two parts, if you like. There's the poetry up until 1868, and then there's the poetry from 1875, the Record of Deutschland, and onwards. His poetry up until 1868, which covers his poetry at school, his poetry at Oxford as well, certainly isn't on the level of his later work, but it's very beautiful in places, and you can see many of the preoccupations which Hopkins brought to bear so perfectly in his later poems, already present in these earlier works. There's a lot of nature in his poetry in his early years, and already there are religious elements to what he wants to express through his poetry. One of the most anthologised poems of these early years is Heaven Haven, A Nun Takes the Veil, which he wrote in 1864 when he was 20. I have desired to go where springs not fail, to fields where flies no sharp and sided hail, and a few lilies blow. And I have asked to be where no storms come, where the green swell is in the havens dumb, and out of the swing of the sea. In this early poem already we can see Hopkins' love of nature, the cove in this stretch of coastland, this haven protecting ships from the wind and from the ravages of the sea. But then he compares that to a nun fulfilling her vocation, finding that sense of completion, that sense of safety, that sense of security in her religious life. So this poem perhaps perfectly sums up those two main preoccupations, that of nature and religion, certainly in these earlier poems. In 1866, Hopkins was received into the Catholic Church by Cardinal John Henry Newman, and in 1868 he decided to become a priest. He felt that was his vocation, and he ritually burnt his poems. He describes this as, in one of his letters, as a massacre of the innocents. Fortunately, copies survived, but it was more of a kind of a show that that period of his life of writing poetry was at an end, and his new life as a priest was beginning. Fortunately for us, in 1875, 7 years later, he was given the license by one of his superiors in the Jesuit order to write a poem inspired by the shipwreck, the SS Deutschland. And Hopkins was particularly moved by the plight of 5 German nuns who lost their lives on board. The Record of Deutschland in late 1875 marks a huge sea change in Hopkins' poetry. After this break of 7 years, a new poetic vision seems to be within Hopkins. All of a sudden his language, his ambitions in terms of what he wants to express in terms of his faith, and of course sprung rhythm, this idea where within the metre of a poem you could have lines of many syllables, which gives the poetry this life, this vivacity, this sense of music, of the joy of sound. The Record of Deutschland is incredibly difficult, as I mentioned at the beginning, but essentially it's a theodicy. It's an attempt to describe how God can use terrible disasters like a shipwreck, which he read in that newspaper at the time, to bring about a greater good. And in this situation he suggests to bring about the salvation of souls. I'll just read the first couple of stanzas. Thou mastering me, God, giver of breath and bread, world strand, sway of the sea, Lord of living and dead, thou hast bound bones and veins in me, fastened me flesh, and after it, almost unmade, what with dread thy doing, and dost thou touch me afresh? Over again I feel thy finger and find thee. I did say yes, O at lightning and lashed rod, thou heardst me truer than tongue confess thy terror, O Christ, O God. Thou knowest the walls, altar and hour and night, the swoon of a heart that the sweep and the hurl of thee trod hard down with the horror of height, and the midriff a strain with leaning of, laced with fire of stress. Note that one of those lines there, how many syllables in that line? The swoon of a heart that the sweep and the hurl of thee trod hard down with the horror of height. Isn't that marvellous? The poetry is just so alive. It certainly is a masterpiece. Incredibly difficult, but well worth getting your head around. And interestingly, he starts to refer to, in this poetry now, influenced by the medieval theologian Duns Scotus, this idea of inscape and in stress, the idea of the thingness of something. I think Scotus called it aequietas, how in every created thing there's something which makes that, something which reveals Christ in there, which also reveals that thing in its most unique way, the kind of essence of something, which also reveals the glory of God. I kiss my hand to the stars, lovely asunder starlight, wafting him out of it, him being Christ, and glow glory in thunder. Kiss my hand to the dappled with downs and west, since, though he is under the world's splendour and wonder, his mystery must be stressed. For I greet him the days I meet him, and bless when I understand. This idea of Christ being revealed, God being revealed through Christ, in the glories of creation, in every created thing, is central to the idea of Hopkins. The incarnation, the doctrine of the incarnation, the Word made flesh, and in turn being revealed through the world, through the creation, is just a constant preoccupation in all this poetry. Of course, the wind hover is, I believe Hopkins regarded this as his best poem, and it is a beautiful poem describing the almost static flight of a kestrel in air when it's riding the wind, but kind of keeping in the same place, scanning the floor for its prey, and then seeing something in that wonder of creation and seeing something of God in there. The wind hover to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off forth on swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valour and act, oh, air, pride, plume, here buckle, and the fire that breaks from thee then, a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, O my chevalier. No wonder of it, Sheer plod makes ploughed down Scillian shine, and blue bleak embers are, my dear, fall, gall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. Isn't that beautiful? Just the way it sounds is just marvellous. The way the embers of the fire at the end, although they look dead and lifeless, break open on the floor below the grate, and this vermilion, this wonderful crimson red comes out from these embers as Christ reveals himself in the most mundane things. Incredibly beautiful. And he wrote a lot of sonnets, the octave being a description usually of something, of a scene, and then the sestet, his kind of religious meditation on that, his spiritual lesson to be drawn from that. Now, I could go on reading these poems forever. I mean, listen to this. This is the leaden echo and the golden echo. I mean, this is just marvellous, so original. This is so strange, particularly when this was written in the late 19th century. It just sounds so modern. Listen to this, the leaden echo. How to keep? Is there any? Is there none such? Nowhere known some. Bow or brooch or braid or brace, lace, latch or catch or key to keep black beauty. Keep it, beauty, 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 from vanishing away. So marvellous, so original, so startlingly innovative and exciting. And that echo, beauty, beauty, beauty. It's beautiful. In his later years in Dublin, he wrote the terrible sonnets, because a name given to him by Robert Bridges, because of the sense of terror, the sense of depression, anxiety, isolation, despair these poems have in them. Bridges found them after Hopkins died. They're really sad, and it seems that Hopkins must have had some kind of nervous breakdown in Dublin. This one is perhaps one of the more famous ones, inspired by a passage in Jeremiah. There's so many scriptural references in Hopkins' poetry, but this really is the sense of God-forsakenness in this sonnet. Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee, but, sir, so what I plead is just. Why do sinners' ways prosper, and why must disappointment all I endeavour end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat thwart me? Oh, the sots and thralls of lust do in spare hours more thrive than I that spend. Sir, life upon thy cause. See, banks and breaks now, leave it, how thick. Laced they are again with fretty chervel, look, and fresh wind shakes them. Birds build, but not I build. No, but strain, time's eunuch, and not breed one work that wakes. Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. This is the words of a faithful man at his lowest ebb. Time's eunuch, that sense of frustration he must have felt. This hugely gifted man, this genius, with nobody even aware of this poem other than himself. God. A man who perhaps felt that life had passed him by because of his devotion to his vocation as a Jesuit priest and his shunning of worldly fame as a poet. Now, in this volume you can also read some of his diary entries, which are fascinating. And what's great about the diary entries is you can see links between the poetry and what motivated the poetry, observations he'd made, things that happened in his life. Really interesting. Also in here are letters, mainly to Robert Bridges, who of course made Hopkins known, so that I can talk about him and countless far more qualified people can. I find one of the letters really moving. This letter dated August the 21st, 1884 from Dublin to Robert Bridges. He basically lists all the people, he numbers the people who may be aware of his poetry, and it's really quite touching and rather sad and moving that this great poet felt he needed to kind of list the people who might recognise him as such. He writes, "Our society cannot be blamed for not valuing what it never knew of. The following are all the people I have let see my poems, not counting occasional pieces. Some of them, however, as you did, have shown them to others. Number 1, the editor and sub-editor of Our Month had the Deutschland and later the Eurydice offered them. 2, my father and mother and 2 sisters saw these, one or both of them. 3, you. 4, Canon Dixon. 5, Mr. Patmore. 6, something got out about the Deutschland and Father Cyprian Splay. Now Stonyhurst wrote to me. 7, and there's seven people basically who knows that he's a poet and he writes poems and poetry, and it's just so moving that he felt he had to write that down, perhaps just to convince himself maybe that he is a poet. And it's quite funny that, you know, he lists his father and mother as one of them, and Bridges himself, who he was writing to. His sermons and retreat notes and meditations are, I suppose, fairly typical of Victorian Catholicism. The rather unyielding denial of worldly comfort, of which of course Hopkins walked the walk, you know, not only talked the talk, he certainly lived out that. You know, his sermon, his meditation on hell is a rather bleak vision, that's for sure. But of course, if you pick this book up, it's going to be about the poetry, and Hopkins' poetry is just spellbinding. So moving, so original, so vibrant, so difficult, so rewarding, so profound, and all imbued with this devout Christian faith, which I suppose would alienate Hopkins from many readers in a largely secular world, in the West anyway. But as a priest myself, an Anglican priest, I can certainly value and I certainly hugely treasure the spiritual aspects of Hopkins' poetry, which now no doubt was the absolute heart of what he was trying to express. So yeah, if you don't know the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, please check it out. It could change your life. And if you've kind of studied it at school at some point, or you have some dim memory of it, go back to some of the poems like the Record of Deutschland, the Windhover Pied Beauty, God's Grandeur, you know, any of these poems, and really take time to uncover their treasures and their beauty, and read them out loud, because they are just beautiful music as well, the way Hopkins uses sound and rhythm. Thanks for watching, and all the best. Bye.